Mick Jagger. What if the most famous rock star on the planet, a man who had everything, everyone, and every stage in the world at his feet, spent decades quietly haunted by one person he let slip away? Not his most glamorous relationship, not his longest, but the one that got under his skin in a way nothing else ever did. That's the story we're telling today. And trust me, by the time we're done, you're going to look at those old Rolling Stones songs very differently. Now, let's set the scene. Mick Jagger is 82 years old. He still walks onto massive stages. Stadiums still go absolutely wild for him. Younger fans look at him like he's some kind of immortal creature, like time itself decided to give this one man a pass. And in a lot of ways, that image has been carefully constructed over 6 decades. Cool, untouchable, always moving forward, never looking back. But here's the thing about people who never look back publicly. Sometimes the things they refuse to say out loud become the loudest parts of their story. And if you pay attention, really pay attention, to Mick Jagger's interviews, his music, the way certain names make him pause just a half-second longer than others, a pattern starts to emerge. One name keeps coming back. One relationship keeps floating to the surface, no matter how deep he tries to bury it. Marianne Faithfull. So who was she really? And why, out of everyone who passed through Mick Jagger's extraordinary life, does her memory seem to follow him like a shadow he can't quite shake? To understand any of this, you have to go back to the beginning. Mick Jagger was born in Dartford, Kent in 1943. And honestly, nothing about his early life screamed future rock legend. His father was a teacher. His family was disciplined, stable, respectable. Young Mick was sharp, ambitious, and surprisingly composed for someone who would later become the living definition of rock and roll chaos. People who knew him as a kid described someone calculating beneath the surface. Someone who understood, even early on, that personality could be a kind of power. The moment that changed everything happened almost by accident. As teenagers, Mick ran into Keith Richards at a railway station in Dartford. Keith noticed Mick carrying albums by Muddy Waters and Chuck Berry, artists that almost no British teenagers were paying attention to back then. That shared obsession sparked something immediate. It wasn't just friendship, it was recognition. Two people realizing they were chasing the same thing before they even had words for what that thing was. By the early 1960s, London was electric. British youth were done with the old rules, old expectations, old politeness. American blues music was bleeding into small clubs all over the city, and a generation of young people were rewriting what it meant to be British. Mick arrived right in the middle of that shift. Alongside Keith and the other future members of the Rolling Stones, he helped build a sound that felt rougher and darker than anything most audiences had heard before. While other pop groups tried to seem charming and safe, the Stones leaned straight into danger. Parents hated them. Young people were obsessed with them. And Mick, even then, understood performance on a level that went beyond natural talent. He knew how to work a room. He knew how to make people uncomfortable in a way that kept them completely glued. The controversy wasn't accidental. It was strategy wrapped inside genuine rebellion. But here's what's important to remember. Underneath all of that confidence was a young man moving at a speed his emotional life simply couldn't keep up with. Fame arrived fast. Celebrity arrived even faster. And before Mick Jagger had fully figured out who he was as a person, the world had already decided who he was going to be as a symbol. That's a heavy thing to carry. Heavier than most people realize. By the mid-1960s, Mick Jagger wasn't just a musician anymore. He was a cultural event. Newspapers treated him like a threat to British civilization. Politicians used his name as a warning. And millions of young people looked at him and saw exactly what they wanted to be. Free, bold, completely unafraid. The image was powerful. The image was also, in many ways, a cage. People close to Mick during those years often described someone who could be incredibly charming one moment and emotionally unreachable the next. Like there was a wall he'd built somewhere early on, and fame had made that wall thicker every year. Relationships came and went. Headlines followed every single one. And the more the tabloids turned his private life into entertainment, the harder genuine intimacy seemed to become. When everything you do becomes public property, You start protecting yourself in ways you don't even fully notice. And then, Marianne Faithfull walked into his life. Now, Marianne was not just another person orbiting Mick Jagger's famous glow. That's important. She had her own artistic identity, her own presence, her own intelligence. She understood literature, music, poetry. She could hold a conversation that had nothing to do with fame or celebrity or whatever was happening in the charts that week. She saw through performance almost immediately, not because she was trying to, but because she was perceptive enough to notice the difference between the act and the actual person behind it. Together, they became one of the defining couples of that entire era. Photographed everywhere, glamorous beyond description. The golden pair of swinging London. But beneath those photographs was something far more complicated and far more real than the images suggested. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Mick Jagger seemed genuinely vulnerable around another person. Not performing vulnerability, actually feeling it. Friends from that period later suggested that Marianne could reach parts of Mick that the rest of the world simply couldn't access. She saw the pressure he was carrying. She saw the loneliness that fame had quietly built around him. And she didn't treat it like something to exploit or celebrate. She just understood it. That kind of understanding is rare. And when you find it as a young person, especially when your entire public life is built around being untouchable, it becomes something you don't easily forget, even decades later. But the world they were living in was not gentle with fragile things. The late 1960s turned darker. Drug culture intensified across London. The same creative explosion that had made their relationship feel magical started consuming everything around it. Privacy became impossible. Every argument, every rough night, every vulnerable moment became tabloid material within hours. And the culture they were part of, the one that celebrated excess as sophistication and self-destruction as artistic freedom, wasn't exactly building the kind of environment where two people could protect something tender. Marianne later spoke openly about those years. The pain, the addiction, the loneliness of loving someone who was also, in a very real sense, public property. She said things that were honest and complicated, not simple bitterness, not pure nostalgia, but something more truthful than either of those. There was always a complicated tenderness underneath her memories of Mick, even when the memories were painful. Mick, being Mick, stayed far more guarded. That emotional restraint had become part of his identity by then. He rarely framed anything in openly sentimental language, but silence has its own way of communicating. Certain hesitations in interviews, certain songs that seem to carry more emotional weight with every passing year. Wild Horses, for example, a track many music historians and longtime fans still connect to the emotional wreckage of their relationship, doesn't sound like a song written by someone who had already moved on cleanly. It sounds like a song written by someone still sitting inside something they couldn't quite resolve. Eventually, the relationship ended. Not explosively, but exhaustedly. Under the weight of everything surrounding it, fame, addiction, distance, and the simple reality that the world they were living in wasn't built for protection or gentleness. The dream collapsed. But Marianne Faithfull did not disappear from Mick Jagger's story. Not emotionally, not artistically. She became the memory that followed him. The 1970s came, then the 80s. Mick kept moving at the speed fame demanded. New relationships, new tours, new headlines. From the outside, nothing had changed. He still looked like the man who never looked back. But something was different beneath the surface, and the people closest to him could occasionally sense it. Marianne's name would surface in ways that other names didn't. There was a quality to the silence around her that felt different from other chapters of his past. Meanwhile, Marianne herself went through years far harder than most people realized. The heights of her fame faded. She struggled with addiction and health problems that would have broken most people completely. But she survived. And the way she survived, with honesty, with artistic resilience, with a refusal to become bitter, said everything about who she had always been underneath the glamour. Now think about that from Mick's perspective. Across all the decades, through all the transformation and noise and success and loss, here was someone who had genuinely known him. Not the symbol, not the rock legend, the actual person he was, before the performance became permanent. That kind of witness, someone who knew you before the world decided what you were, is almost impossible to replace. You can build new relationships, you can find new love, but you cannot manufacture that specific kind of knowing. And here's what makes the whole story feel almost unbearably human. Their relationship wasn't a fairy tale. It was messy and painful and damaged by forces neither of them fully controlled. But imperfect relationships often leave the deepest marks precisely because they stay emotionally unfinished. There's no clean ending to process, no comfortable resolution to file away. Just a feeling that lives somewhere between memory and regret, surfacing at quiet moments when the noise of life temporarily dies down. Mick Jagger spent decades becoming one of the most recognizable human beings on Earth. He played for crowds that most people can't even imagine. He outlived musical eras. He outlived entire versions of culture. He watched the London he grew up in transform beyond recognition. Many of the people who defined that world alongside him are gone now. Some taken by excess, some by illness, some simply by time. And what does age do to a person who has lived at that scale? It strips away the performance. Slowly, quietly, it removes the things you thought would protect you and leaves you alone with the memories that actually mattered. Not the biggest concerts, not the most famous moments. The faces of people who knew you when you were still figuring out what your face was supposed to look like. He in his 80s still walks on stage, still commands a room. But there's a different quality to the way audiences experience those performances now. Because the songs that once sounded like rebellion now sound like something else entirely. They sound like memory. They sound like survival. They sound like a man who has outlived so much looking back across a very long road and recognizing, perhaps more clearly than ever, what was real and what was performance. And at the end of that long, extraordinary road, Marianne Faithfull remains. Not as a regret exactly, not as a wound that never healed, but as a reminder of something specific. The version of Mick Jagger that existed before fame hardened everything around him. The version of himself that was still reachable, still genuinely open to another person in a way that decades of celebrity slowly made more and more difficult. Fame can do so many things. It can make you immortal in the eyes of millions. It can fill every room you enter with adoration and energy and noise. But it cannot give you back a single moment you left behind. It cannot rebuild a connection that got lost in the chaos of becoming legendary. And it absolutely cannot manufacture the feeling of being truly known by another person before the world decided who you were going to be. That may be the most human thing about Mick Jagger's entire story. All the stages, all the records, all the decades of being larger than life. And still, underneath all of it, a memory that wouldn't quietly fade. A woman who saw the real person and not just the rock star. A relationship that never quite found its ending. Some loves don't resolve, they just echo. And maybe that's why we're still talking about this. Not because it's a celebrity gossip story, but because most of us, if we're really honest with ourselves, have our own version of it. The relationship that stayed unfinished. The person who knew us before we built our defenses. The connection that got lost in the noise of becoming whoever we eventually became. If this story hit differently than you expected, share it with someone who loves music and complicated human truth in equal measure. There are more stories like this one waiting, because the most fascinating thing about legends isn't the mythology. It's the very human beating heart underneath it.